It was a busy afternoon at the airport. People were moving in every direction, rushing to catch flights, meet loved ones, or simply get through the long security lines. Among the crowd was Maya, a young black woman, walking with confidence through the terminal. She wore a well-tailored suit, her diplomatic badge clipped to her jacket, showing her role as a UN representative. She had just finished a critical meeting abroad and was looking forward to her next assignment. Maya approached the customs counter, ready for the usual passport check. The officer at the desk was a middle-aged white man. His smile seemed polite enough, but there was something in his eyes that made Maya uneasy. He scanned her passport, flipping through its pages, pausing for a moment on one of the stamps. She noticed a subtle frown starting to form on his face. "Excuse me, ma'am," the officer said, his voice firm but not unfriendly. "I'm afraid there's an issue with your passport." Maya raised an eyebrow. She had traveled frequently for work, and her documents were always in order. "What seems to be the problem?" she asked calmly, though she felt a knot forming in her stomach. The officer turned the passport toward his computer screen, scanning it again, then shook his head. "This passport, it doesn't match the data in our system. It appears to be fake." Maya was taken aback. "What do you mean, fake?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "This is my official UN passport. I travel internationally all the time. There's no mistake." The officer looked at her with skepticism, clearly unconvinced. "I'm afraid I'll have to refer you for further inspection. Please step aside, ma'am." Confused and slightly frustrated, Maya complied. She couldn't understand how her valid diplomatic passport could be questioned, especially by someone who should be trained to recognize official documents. As she stood off to the side, the officer made a call to another officer, explaining the situation. Seconds felt like hours as Maya's patience began to wear thin. She had been through this process countless times before, and never once had there been an issue. The officer returned with another colleague, both now scrutinizing her passport as if it were something to be examined under a magnifying glass. "I assure you," Maya said, trying to remain calm, "I am who I say I am. I'm a UN diplomat. This is not a fake passport." The officers didn't respond, continuing to inspect her documents and whispering to each other. The commotion was drawing attention from nearby travelers, who began to glance over, noticing the increasing tension. Maya felt her heart rate quicken, but she kept her composure. "Please, just verify with my embassy," Maya urged. "They can confirm my identity." The officers, still unconvinced, simply nodded but didn't act. Maya knew she needed to remain calm, but the feeling of being judged solely by her appearance, rather than her credentials, started to settle in. She was no stranger to the biases that existed in the world, but this was different. This time, she was not just a woman walking through an airport. She was being questioned because of her race, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was happening here, something that went beyond just a routine check. As the tension mounted, Maya stood there, uncertain of what would happen next. Would she be allowed to continue her journey, or was she about to experience something far more complicated? The officer's next words would change everything. Maya stood quietly as the officers continued to examine her passport. Her mind raced, trying to understand what had gone wrong. She had always made sure to follow all rules and procedures, but now, for some reason, her official UN passport was being questioned. The officer on the phone had said something about checking her credentials further, but it felt like the situation was escalating out of control. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. The airport terminal buzzed with activity, but Maya's world had shrunk to just the cold, impersonal counter and the two officers inspecting her documents. She tried to stay calm, taking deep breaths, as she realized how much this situation was beginning to feel unfair. After what seemed like a long wait, one of the officers returned with a phone in hand. He gestured for her to take it. "Please, hold for a moment," he said, his tone now more formal. Maya hesitated but then took the phone, wondering if this would finally resolve the confusion. The voice on the other end sounded professional, but it was not familiar to her. "This is Officer Harper. We are currently verifying your passport details. Can you please confirm your name and position?" Maya spoke clearly, her voice steady. "I'm Maya Williams, a diplomatic officer representing the United Nations. I'm currently traveling back from an official mission. You can contact my embassy for confirmation if needed." There was a pause on the other end of the line before the officer responded. "Thank you. Please hold for just a moment while we verify the details." As Maya waited, she couldn't help but feel a sinking sensation in her stomach. The longer this took, the more she feared something was wrong. She had never been in a situation like this before. She had always felt proud to serve her country and represent the United Nations, but today something felt off. She wondered if her race had something to do with the treatment she was receiving. After all, how many times had she seen similar situations happen to other people who didn't look like her? The officers remained silent as they continued their check. She could hear the soft hum of the airport in the background. People chatting, the distant sound of an announcement. But for Maya, the only sound that mattered now was the silence in the room and the weight of what was happening. Finally, the officer returned, a more serious look on his face. He took the phone back from Maya and spoke to the person on the other end. "I'm sorry for the confusion," he said, his tone changing. "It appears that this passport is indeed legitimate. The embassy has confirmed her status as a UN representative." Maya felt a sense of relief wash over her, but she also felt anger bubbling inside. How could something like this happen? How could she be treated this way based on assumptions and prejudice? The officers stood silently, no longer questioning her, but the damage had already been done. She had been delayed, humiliated, and treated like a criminal when all she had done was travel for her job. Her heart pounded, but she knew she had to keep her composure. She wasn't going to let this stop her. As she walked toward the exit, Maya couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. The truth had been revealed, but there was still so much left to process. What had just happened? And why did it feel like this wasn't just an isolated mistake, but part of something bigger? Little did she know, the situation was far from over. The real story of who she was, and the power of her family's connections, was about to unfold in ways she could never have imagined. Maya walked out of the airport security area, her mind still buzzing with what had just happened. Her passport had been deemed fake, and she had been treated like a criminal simply for being who she was. She couldn't believe it. She had spent years building her career as a diplomat. And now, in one moment, everything felt like it was crumbling around her. She felt the sting of humiliation, but also a deep sense of frustration. Why had they treated her this way? She was a representative of the United Nations, a position of respect and responsibility. And yet, the officers had treated her with such suspicion, as though she were just another person to be doubted and questioned. As she sat in the waiting area, she couldn't help but replay the events over and over again. She tried to calm herself, reminding herself that this wasn't her fault. It was the fault of the prejudices that some people carried with them, often without realizing the harm they were doing. The officer's words echoed in her mind, especially the way he had demanded she prove herself when it should have been a simple matter. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was a number she didn't recognize, but something told her this call was important. With a deep breath, Maya answered. "Hello," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Maya," a familiar voice said, "It's your father." Maya felt her heart skip a beat. Her father, a senior official with the FBI, was not someone who called her often. But his voice now seemed calm, reassuring. "I heard about the incident. I'm sorry you had to go through that. But don't worry. I'm handling it from here." Maya blinked in surprise. "What do you mean, Dad? How do you know about it?" "I've just been informed about the situation. The officer who questioned you, he didn't realize who you are. He didn't understand the gravity of your position," her father continued, his voice still calm but firm. "I've already contacted the authorities to look into this." Maya felt a wave of relief rush over her. Her father was a powerful man, someone who had helped her navigate through many difficult situations in her life. She knew that with his support, this incident would soon be addressed. But that didn't mean it was over for her. Maya wanted to understand why this had happened in the first place. Why had the officer been so quick to doubt her? "I appreciate you helping me, Dad, but it's more than just about the passport. This situation feels wrong. It's not just about the paperwork. It's about how I was treated. I'm being judged just because of the way I look," Maya said, her voice shaking slightly. Her father paused for a moment, and when he spoke again, there was a hint of sadness in his voice. "I know, Maya. You're right. And this isn't something we can ignore. We will take care of it. But for now, I want you to focus on getting back home safely. We'll talk more once you're back, okay?" Maya agreed, feeling comforted by her father's words. She hung up the phone and closed her eyes for a moment. She was grateful for his support, but there was still a part of her that couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. What had really happened at that airport? And what would happen next? Maya stood up, taking a deep breath. The journey ahead wasn't just about proving herself as a diplomat anymore. It was about fighting for fairness, for respect, and for the truth. Maya sat quietly in the airport lounge, her thoughts swirling. It had been hours since the incident, and she was still shaken. Her father's reassuring words echoed in her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling of unfairness. She had been treated with disrespect, and the officers had made her feel small, unimportant. As she looked around at the busy terminal, she wondered how many other people had experienced something similar, how many had been judged by the color of their skin or the way they looked, without ever having the chance to prove their worth. Maya knew her position as a UN diplomat carried weight. She was an official representative of one of the most influential organizations in the world. Yet it felt like that status had meant nothing when she was questioned and treated like a criminal. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. The officer's behavior was not just a misunderstanding. It was a direct result of ignorance and prejudice. Her father's words had been comforting, but she knew they wouldn't be enough. This wasn't just about fixing a mistake. It was about making sure something like this didn't happen to anyone else. Maya wasn't one to stay silent when it came to injustice. She had spent her entire career fighting for diplomacy, peace, and equality. And now she would have to fight for her own dignity. As she boarded the flight back home, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. She would use this moment, this painful experience, to fuel the change she had been working for all her life. The journey ahead would be difficult, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. Once home, Maya wasted no time in reaching out to her colleagues and superiors at the United Nations. She explained what had happened in detail, and soon, the story began to spread. News outlets picked up the story, and what had started as a personal grievance turned into a larger conversation about racial discrimination and the treatment of diplomats and minorities in international settings. The outpouring of support from people around the world was overwhelming. Maya received messages from other diplomats, community leaders, and even everyday citizens who had experienced similar situations. Many shared their own stories of discrimination, telling Maya how her bravery in speaking out had inspired them to do the same. As the weeks went by, Maya's fight continued. Her father, who had been instrumental in pushing for the investigation, stayed by her side, offering guidance and support. Together, they met with officials and organizations to discuss ways to combat discrimination at airports and in other places of authority. Maya wanted real change, not just apologies. She wanted a system where people of all backgrounds were treated equally, no matter their skin color or nationality. The airport incident had been a painful moment for Maya, but it had also opened her eyes to the wider issues of racism and injustice that still existed in the world. With the strength of her convictions and the support of her family, Maya knew she was ready to take on the challenge. This was just the beginning of a journey that would change not only her life, but also the lives of others who had been silenced for too long. Maya was determined to make sure that her fight for justice would be heard. Maya's story had spread quickly, and soon, She was not just a diplomat, but a symbol of resistance. People across the globe began to recognize her bravery in standing up against an unjust system. While she had initially felt defeated and alone in that airport terminal, she now found herself surrounded by supporters, all rallying behind her cause. Her inbox was filled with messages from others who had faced discrimination and were inspired by her strength. At first, Maya's focus had been on herself, on clearing her name and ensuring that the officers who had mistreated her were held accountable. But as the days passed, she began to realize that this situation was bigger than her own experience. The issue at hand was part of a larger, ongoing problem. Discrimination, whether in airports, workplaces, or in daily life, was something many people faced, regardless of their status. Maya couldn't ignore the opportunity in front of her. She had always believed in the power of change through diplomacy, but now she was seeing the importance of standing up and taking action. She knew that using her voice could bring attention to the bigger issues that plagued not just her country, but others around the world. Her first step was to meet with people who had the resources to help. She reached out to other diplomats, human rights organizations, and even legal experts who could provide insight into how to address the systemic racism that had led to her situation. Together, they brainstormed ways to raise awareness and ensure that her case wasn't seen as an isolated incident. This was about changing the rules, changing the way society viewed people of color in positions of power. Maya was soon invited to several high-profile meetings, including one with the United Nations Human Rights Council. Here, she would speak on behalf of those who had faced unfair treatment. But her voice was powerful not only because of her position as a diplomat, but because of the strength she had shown by sharing her personal story. It wasn't just about a woman at an airport. It was about a global issue that affected millions. Despite the progress she had made, Maya knew the battle wasn't over. The road to justice would take time, and she was prepared for that. She continued to work closely with the media, ensuring that her message remained in the spotlight. Every news story, every interview was another chance to push for change. But more importantly, it was a chance for Maya to meet people who had shared similar stories of discrimination, people who were now ready to speak up as well. With every step, Maya began to feel less like a victim and more like a leader. The incident at the airport had been painful, but it had given her a purpose. Now she was no longer just fighting for herself. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been unjustly treated, for everyone who had been silenced. Maya's work wasn't just about the fight for equality. It was about creating a world where everyone, no matter their background, could walk through an airport or any door without fear of being judged based on their appearance. It was about teaching respect and understanding, ensuring that people, no matter where they came from, were treated with the dignity they deserved. And as Maya stood in front of large crowds, speaking to a growing movement, she knew that her journey had just begun. She had the world's attention now, and she was determined to use it to build a future where equality wasn't just an ideal but a reality. Maya's phone rang incessantly. Each call brought with it more momentum for her cause. Human rights groups, civil rights advocates, and fellow diplomats reached out to her with words of support and offers of help. What had started as a personal battle had now become a global movement. Maya, once just a woman quietly going about her diplomatic work, had become the face of a larger fight for justice. But with the rising support came immense pressure. The media attention had shifted from simply focusing on her passport incident to questioning deeper issues within the system. How many other individuals, like Maya, had faced similar discrimination and had not had the means or platform to speak up? Maya realized that her experience was not unique. She knew that it was essential not to let her personal story overshadow the larger fight against systemic racism and inequality. In the following weeks, Maya worked tirelessly with her legal team to press charges against the officers involved. As a diplomat, she had been subjected to mistreatment by those who should have known better. She would not rest until justice was served. But the case was not just about holding a few individuals accountable. It was about dismantling the barriers that allowed racial bias to flourish unchecked in everyday institutions. She began holding press conferences and speeches, each one more powerful than the last. Her words resonated deeply with people who had felt the sting of discrimination, people who had been unheard for so long. Maya spoke for those who had no voice, and her voice grew louder every day. During one of her speeches at a prominent conference, Maya revealed something that touched the hearts of many. "I am fighting not just for myself," she said, "but for the countless men and women, parents, and children who are unfairly treated every day." Her words echoed in the hall, and there was an undeniable shift in the room. The audience was moved, not just by her story, but by the realization that they had a part to play in changing the system. People began to share their own experiences, their own struggles, in public forums and online platforms. Maya had unknowingly sparked a wave of testimonies that flooded social media and news outlets. From all over the world, individuals came forward, recounting their tales of injustice, many of which had been buried for years. Maya knew that the fight ahead would not be easy, but she also knew that together, they could bring about change. With each passing day, more and more voices joined the conversation. Politicians, lawyers, activists, and citizens alike rallied around the cause. Maya knew that this was no longer just about one woman's fight. It was about ensuring that no one else had to go through what she had endured. Her dream was now a shared vision. A world where no one would ever be unjustly detained, profiled, or harmed simply because of their race. Despite all the support, there were still challenges ahead. The legal battles were far from over, and Maya often found herself exhausted by the weight of the cause she carried. But each new supporter, each new testimony, gave her the strength to push forward. She no longer felt like an individual fighting a lone battle. She felt like the leader of a movement that would not rest until true equality and justice were achieved. As Maya looked ahead, she saw a future filled with possibilities, a future where her struggle would serve as a turning point in history. And she knew she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for all those who deserved to be treated fairly and with dignity. Maya sat in her office, a mountain of papers in front of her. Each document was a step toward her goal. But even as her legal battle continued, the pressure seemed to grow heavier. There was no escaping the constant media attention and the increasing scrutiny from both allies and critics. Yet despite everything, Maya knew she had to keep fighting, not just for her own dignity, but for the countless others who had been treated unjustly in similar situations. Her phone buzzed constantly with updates, calls from her lawyers, activists, and even people she had never met before. Most of them were filled with words of encouragement, but there were also messages from those who disagreed with her, those who questioned whether she was making too much of a situation that, in their eyes, could have been handled differently. Maya knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but her commitment to justice remained unwavering. Maya had come to understand that this wasn't just about her or one bad encounter at an airport. It was about challenging the system that allowed people to be treated differently based on their race. She had always known that racism existed, but the incident had opened her eyes to the extent of the problem. It wasn't just about a few isolated incidents, but about deep-rooted prejudices that shaped everyday life for so many. The legal team was hard at work, but it wasn't just legal action that could bring about change. It was public awareness. Maya knew that she had a unique platform and had to use it to educate and spread awareness. She began giving interviews, speaking to groups, and writing op-eds. She wanted people to understand the pain and frustration of being unfairly targeted, of being seen as different simply because of the color of one's skin. She wanted them to see the humanity behind the headlines. As Maya's voice grew louder, so did the voices of others. More and more stories of mistreatment, profiling, and unfair treatment began to surface. People who had been silent for years started sharing their own experiences, creating a powerful community of support. It was a turning point, an awakening of sorts. For the first time, people were willing to openly discuss the reality of systemic racism. One of the most powerful moments came when Maya met with a group of young activists. They were passionate, full of energy, and ready to take on the world. Their ideas were fresh, and they had a hunger for change that was contagious. Maya listened to their stories and realized that the next generation was already ahead of her in some ways. They weren't willing to accept the status quo. They were determined to dismantle it. Maya felt a surge of hope. This was bigger than one individual's fight. It was the beginning of a movement that would reshape society. There was no going back now. The voices of those who had been silenced for so long were finally being heard, and together they were creating a future where racial injustice would no longer be tolerated. As she prepared for her next speech, Maya took a deep breath and looked out of her office window. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with challenges, but she also knew she wasn't alone. She had the support of thousands, and their collective voice would be the catalyst for real, lasting change. Maya was no longer just a diplomat. She had become a leader in a movement. The fight for justice was far from over, but she knew one thing for certain. The world would never be the same again. Months had passed since the airport incident, and Maya was beginning to see the fruits of her labor. What had started as a personal experience of unfair treatment had sparked a much larger conversation. The outpouring of support had been incredible, and as more people shared their stories, the momentum behind the movement continued to grow. Maya realized that her journey wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about making lasting change for everyone affected by inequality. Her days had become a whirlwind of meetings, speeches, and interviews. She had become a leading voice in the fight for racial equality, and her work was being noticed globally. The legal battle with the officers involved in the incident was still ongoing, but Maya was more focused on the bigger picture now. She knew that changing the system would require more than just legal victories. It would require a change in how society viewed race, privilege, and justice. One afternoon, Maya was invited to speak at a major international conference on human rights. It was one of the most important events of her career, and she felt a mix of excitement and nerves. She had spoken at many events before, but this felt different. She was no longer just a diplomat. She was a symbol of the struggle for fairness, and she understood the weight of her words. As she stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. Maya took a deep breath and began speaking, her voice steady and strong. "I stand here today not just as a diplomat, but as a woman who has been affected by the very system I work within," she began. "I am here because I believe in change. I believe that no one, no matter their race, should have to face discrimination in the place they work, the airport they travel through, or the country they call home." The audience listened intently, and Maya could see that her words were resonating. She spoke about her personal experience at the airport, how it had opened her eyes to the biases and assumptions that still plagued society. But she didn't just focus on the injustice. She spoke about the solutions, about how to move forward, about the importance of empathy, education, and awareness. "We must teach the next generation that differences are not something to be feared or judged. We must build a world where everyone is valued, where every person, regardless of their background, is treated with respect and dignity," Maya said passionately. The applause that followed was heartfelt and loud. Maya could feel the support from the crowd, but more than that, she felt a sense of hope. She knew that this was just one step in a long journey, but it was an important one. After the speech, Maya met with activists, government officials, and educators who were eager to join her cause. Together, they discussed ways to implement better training for law enforcement and airport staff, focusing on cultural sensitivity and racial awareness. Maya knew that systemic change couldn't happen overnight, but every small step forward was progress. As she left the conference, Maya felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would still be difficult, but she wasn't afraid. She had seen the power of collective action, and she knew that with enough voices united, real change was possible. Maya had learned that her story, her fight, was not just hers alone. It was the fight of every person who had ever been judged by their skin color or background. And she was more determined than ever to ensure that the world she left behind was one where equality was a reality for all. Her journey was far from over, but Maya was ready to continue the fight. The change she had started would ripple through generations to come. And that, she believed, was just the beginning.